Dickie Dread, The New Age Travellers, A History, 1960-1990. Chapter 8, The Road to Rave. The rise of the Bew Crew and smack use. Some of the magic drained out. What had once been a mobile cultural resistance began to feel like marginalised poverty on wheels. Emerging during a period of disillusionment and stagnation within the broader traveller movement was a subculture widely and often pejoratively referred to as the Bew Crew. This wasn't a formal group, collective or tribe, but rather a loosely applied label, usually by outsiders or other travellers, describing individuals, often young, disaffected or marginalised, who lived in semi-permanent encampments and were frequently associated with heavy alcohol consumption, particularly of cheap cider, fortified wine or special brew. These individuals were often seen on the fringes of larger sites, busking, scouring bins or running informal stalls, part of the scene yet frequently estranged from its earlier ethos. Unlike the spiritually minded hippies of the 1970s or the politically motivated punks who had come before, many Bew Crew members appeared disconnected from any wider social movement or vision of liberation. Their presence was more about surviving on the margins than transforming society. And yet, for many, that disengagement came out of apathy, but from burnout, the cumulative weight of years spent being moved on, arrested, vilified and misunderstood. To those watching from the outside, the press, the police, the suburban public, and even to some within the scene, the Bew Crew became emblematic of traveller decline, a raw, chaotic, sometimes threatening presence that evoked loss rather than hope. They were seen by some as what was left after the Beanfield, the heroin era, the death of Windsor. A generation numbed by displacement, institutionalised violence and social collapse. Yet the label was also oversimplified, often wielded as a broad brush to shame those who didn't conform to an idealised vision of mobile nomad. Not everyone who drank was aimless. Not everyone who lived rough had no values. Some Bew Crew individuals were musicians, tinkerers, storytellers or grafters in disguise. Others ironically became key players in the emerging rave scene, helping to launch sound systems, secure woodland venues or ferry punters in battered out beloved buses. But still, their increased visibility altered public perception of travellers. Once mythologised as barefoot, free spirits or cultural rebels, they were now more often cast as antisocial nuisances, prone to crime, addiction and disorder. The era of wide-eyed wonder had given way to tabloid panic, and for many who were part of and adjacent to the Bew Crew, that stigma would prove hard to shake. Heroin began to seep into the fringes of the traveller scene during the 1980s, creeping in slowly at first and then more noticeably as the decade closed. It wasn't the scene's drug of choice, not like acid or hash or shrooms, but it had one crucial advantage: it was cheap. The Black Rock variant, which flooded UK cities at the time, was often cut down for price and distributed widely for underground networks that now stretched even into the more remote traveller sites. At a time when many travellers were already demoralised, hounded by police, moved on endlessly, or living with the psychological aftermath of events like the Battle of the Beanfield, heroin began to offer not euphoria, but numbness. It became a quiet coping mechanism, something to dull the boredom, mask the trauma and soothe the loss of community. For some, it felt like a reprieve from a life under siege. By 1989, its presence was undeniable on certain sites. The change wasn't always dramatic, but it was cumulative. Petty thefts, once rare, became more common. Fuel was siphoned during the night, toolboxes went missing, dogs disappeared, and long-trusted mates became unreliable. The open spirit of earlier camps, where tea was passed from fire to fire and tools were shared freely, gave way to a growing climate of suspicion. Vans were locked earlier. Fires were guarded. People watched their backs. Perhaps most telling of all, the old codes began to fray. Only a few years earlier, a known heroin dealer would have been run off site, sometimes violently. The scene, anarchic though it was, had its own rough justice, and gear was taboo. But by the early 1990s, dealers were not just tolerated, they were sometimes welcomed, whether they lived in a bus or came in from the estates. Travellers or not, if they had what people needed, they stayed. The change didn't affect every site or every crew, and many continued to reject smack outright. But where heroin took hold, it hollowed things out. Trust fractured, creativity stalled. Gatherings became quieter. And for a scene already under attack from the outside, this eternal corrosion was devastating. Old communal trust eroded in places. People went missing, a few overdosed. More just faded from sight. Heroin wasn't the problem, it was a symptom. A sign that the movement, so full of fire and defiance just a few years earlier, was losing its way. The push and pull of societal abuse. The Trewargy Tree Fair, held in 1989 near St Column Major in Cornwall, was one of the first large-scale free festivals before the full weight of the authorities clamped down on such gatherings. Set on remote farmland with woods and open space, Trewargy attracted a mix of punks, travellers and sound systems. It combined traditional fair elements, craft stalls, herbalists and workshops with a full-blown alternative music scene, including anarcho-punk, dub and the emerging techno underground. But what began as a promising gathering quickly spiralled into chaos. Accounts from attendees described scenes of aggression, intoxication and disorganisation. Some reported fights breaking out between different groups, often fuelled by excessive alcohol or drug use. Few even spoke of a pervasive, unsettling atmosphere. Stories of stabbings circulated that were rarely confirmed. Others mentioned a growing sense of lawlessness and a fear at night. While not every corner of the festival succumbed to this energy, and many still recall the music and communal fire pits fondly, Trewargy, 1989, had gone down in memory as a turning point, a moment when the darker currents of the scene became impossible to ignore. Despite its remote location and the peaceful intentions of most attendees, the festival faced heavy-handed policing. Several arrests were made, and local authorities used the event to push for stronger enforcement measures on unauthorised gatherings. Trewargy remains a symbolic moment, a final expression of the festival freedom before the introduction of the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act 1994. The traveller culture came under increasing pressure from the state in the late 1980s and 1990s. A more dangerous threat also began to rise: vigilante attacks. These had always occurred, but far less frequently. Across rural Britain, particularly in southern England, farmer militias, concerned citizen patrols and unofficial village watch groups began confronting travellers directly, often with intimidation, violence and zero accountability. Some wore high-vis jackets and carried radios. Others wore balaclavas and carried baseball bats. Vehicles were torched in lay-bys after local leaflets warned of undesirables arriving. Stones were thrown and petrol bombs lobbed into camps at night. In Sussex, Kent and Somerset, traveller women were followed and harassed while walking into shops. On one site in Hampshire, shotgun fire was reported over buses to scare them off. No arrests were made. I personally had a shotgun aimed at me as we frantically tried to reverse out of a site in Kent. Tabloids had laid the groundwork: feral, dole scum, dirty hippies, thieves. Each headline gave licence to treat travellers as less than human, unworthy of protection. Even peaceful encampments, with permission from landowners, faced hostility. Vigilantes claimed they were protecting the countryside, but many acted on deep prejudice and class resentment. And often, police turned a blind eye, or quietly approved. They might not say it outright, said one traveller from the era, but when the locals come with dogs and chains, the cops tend to arrive late. In response, some traveller crews took turns on night watch, set up vehicle barricades, used CB radios and spotters, and formed informal alliances with anti-fascist groups and squat networks. And we gave what we got sometimes. I'll never forget chasing a bunch of football wankers off a site armed to the teeth with wood prep tools. The rise of social media has curbed some vigilante actions and amplified resistance, but hostile locals, Facebook scare posts and anti-traveller bias still drive harassment, especially for gypsy communities who face overlapping racism and classism. There were also quiet wins: supportive landowners, brave journalists, a few police who refused to be part of the harassment, but for many, nightfall meant fear. This fear in turn led to a deep distrust of locals. Many travellers had no choice but to protect themselves. We became more violent in our wails, more aggressive in attitude, and more solemn. To this day, I still sleep with my trusted metal twatting stick close by. The police didn't stop after the Beanfield. They adapted, refining their tactics. Roadblocks were now deployed before festivals even began. Powers under the Public Order Act 1986, especially those related to gatherings and trespass, were increasingly used to shut down events even before a crime have occurred. Squats and lay-bys were raided at dawn. Vehicles were impounded on grounds of unroadworthiness. Even where no direct offence could be proved, enforcement relied on intimidation, dispersal orders and public discretion, creating a climate of fear and exhaustion across the traveller network. In 1988 to 89, local councils worked with new civil injunctions to bar certain individuals, by name, from entire counties. Criminal Justice and Public Order Act wasn't law yet, but its shadow was growing. Places like Bluebell Hill, Porchester Common, Stony Cross, Worthing, the Newbury Bypass camps, early versions, had once been bubbling hives of countercultural energy. Now many were stripped bare, reduced to embattled enclaves. Council efforts to build so-called transit sites in the wake of growing pressure to manage nomadic communities were, more often than not, little more than public relation gestures. On paper, these sites were intended to provide temporary sanctioned spaces where travellers could stay for limited periods without fear of eviction. They were promoted as a solution to the problem of roadside encampments and as proof of council's willingness to balance public order with traveller rights. But in practice, the real aim was dispersal. Many of these sites were poorly maintained, built on industrial wasteland or fire or flood-prone land, far from any town centre, social services or even safe access to water. Infrastructure was minimal, security was high. Some had entry conditions so restrictive, for example requiring permanent addresses, registration paperwork or prior approval, that they were effectively inaccessible to those who needed them most. Additionally, time limits were strictly enforced, with police or enforcement officers arriving at dawn on their expiration date. The goal wasn't to accommodate, it was to regulate, fragment and control. Travellers, especially after the introduction of laws like the 1994 Criminal Justice and Public Order Act, found these sites were often just another tool of surveillance and containment. Instead of being welcome spaces, they became a symbol of exclusion, tightly monitored zones designed not to integrate but to keep people out of the sight and on the move. As one traveller put it at the time, they built the sites in places no one wants to live and acted shocked when we didn't want to live there. The battle over who gets to exist on the land, who belongs and who is seen as a threat remains unfinished. Meanwhile, anti-traveller media narratives intensified. Tabloids ran photographs of rubbish piles and junked buses. They mocked the clothes, the faces, the smells, feeding fear. Who the fuck are this lot? Ironically, as some of the original travellers began to fall into decline, worn down by years of evictions, police harassment and the creeping rise of addiction, a fresh wave of dropouts emerged from the cities. These newcomers were younger, often angrier and deeply politicised. Punks, ravers, squatting and anarchists brought with them not just idealism, but entire toolkits of change, DIY sound systems, radical literature, mobile kitchens and a taste for direct action. Their presence marked a shift from the spiritual escapism of the 1970s style hippies to a more confrontational, urban inflicted counterculture. Some were welcomed, others were met with suspicion. Long-term road crews, hardened by years of rough travel and tribal knowledge, sometimes saw the new arrivals as naive or disrespectful of hard-won codes, but their influx couldn't be ignored. These townfolk added new beats to old engines. They invigorated what was stagnating. Rave flyers joined crumbling crash posters. Vegan cookpots stood beside diesel tanks. The overlap wasn't always easy, but it was transformative, sparking new fusions, new tensions, and ultimately a new direction for the travelling scene. By the end of the 1980s, a change was in the air. Some travellers, old convoy heads and new squat kids alike, were tinkling with sound systems, linking up with ravers and planning parties not based on tradition but on volume. A squat pie in Bristol, a generator in a cowfield, speakers borrowed from a reggae rig, a DJ with one box of records and a dream. The anarcho-punks had warned of dystopia, the travellers had lived in it, but the ravers? They were ready to dance in it, and soon the roads would pulse again.